At 3:15 a.m., I unlocked the door. My fiancée's heels were on the floor. My best friend's shoes were beside them. I opened the bedroom. She was on top of him laughing. I still remember the exact time because the clock on the hallway wall was the first thing I saw when I stepped into the apartment that night. It read 3:15 a.m. I hadn't planned to be home that early. The trip I was supposed to take ran into delays, then cancellations, and finally I decided to just drive back instead of wasting another night in a hotel room. My fiancée didn't expect me. That fact, I think, is what made everything unfold so clearly. When people don't expect to be caught, they stop hiding. The first thing I noticed when I unlocked the door was the silence. Not the usual quiet of an apartment in the middle of the night, but a weighted silence, broken only by faint, muffled sounds coming from down the hallway. The second thing I noticed were the shoes. Her heels lay tipped over on the floor beside the entrance, one on its side, the other half buried under my jacket that she must have knocked down earlier. And next to them, lined up almost neatly, were a pair of men's sneakers. I knew them instantly. They belonged to my best friend. For a split second my brain tried to make excuses. Maybe he dropped by late. Maybe something had happened and he needed a place to crash. But the muffled laughter coming from the bedroom cut through those illusions before they could settle. I walked down the hall, every step loud against the wooden floor. The door was cracked just enough for me to push it open without resistance. The scene inside froze me in place. My fiancée was on top of him, straddling him on our bed, both of them tangled in the sheets, laughing like it was the most natural thing in the world. My best friend didn't even look surprised when I entered. His eyes flicked toward me for half a second, then back to her, almost as if to say, "Well, here it is." The laughter stopped only when I spoke. Not shouting, not screaming, just saying the first thing that came to mind. My voice sounded foreign even to me, flat and heavy. Both of them turned their heads in my direction, and in that instant the room shifted from playful to tense. She climbed off him slowly, not out of shame, but as though she were annoyed at being interrupted. She reached for a blanket, not to cover herself, but to wrap lazily around her shoulders. He sat up on the bed, not a hint of panic, just waiting to see what I would do. That reaction made everything sharper. If they had scrambled, if they had tried to hide, maybe there would have been some twisted satisfaction in seeing their fear. But the way they looked at me, casual, almost confident, cut deeper than the act itself. I asked them one question. How long? She answered before he could open his mouth, telling me it wasn't what I thought. He smirked, shaking his head slightly, like her excuse wasn't even worth backing up. She kept talking, fumbling through half-sentences about being drunk, about how I had been too distant, about how things just happened. I didn't believe a single word. My eyes kept drifting to the details around the room. The wine glass on the nightstand. The candle she had lit, one she usually saved for special nights. The way his shirt was folded neatly on the chair, not tossed carelessly like a sudden mistake, but placed with the calmness of someone who had been there before. The argument grew louder. She tried to push the blame onto me, saying I was never home enough, that I worked too much, that I didn't give her the attention she deserved. He chimed in at one point, claiming they didn't mean for it to happen, but his tone was hollow, like he wasn't even trying. He couldn't stop smirking. I felt heat rising in my chest, but I forced myself not to lose control. I wasn't going to give them that satisfaction. I told him to get dressed and leave, but he just sat there. She snapped at me, saying I had no right to kick him out because he was her guest too. That was when I realized they weren't afraid of me at all. They thought they held the power in this situation. They thought I would yell, maybe throw something, then eventually calm down and let it pass. The noise carried. Someone from the apartment next door banged against the wall and shouted for us to quiet down. That only made the tension sharper. My fiancée rolled her eyes, telling me I was making a scene. The audacity of it almost made me laugh. I turned my attention to my best friend. I asked him directly how long it had been going on. He hesitated, then finally muttered that it had been a couple of months. The way he said it, casual, like confessing to borrowing money without asking, made my fists clench. I wanted to drag him off the bed and break his smug face, but something inside me stopped. Violence would only make me look like the villain in their story. And judging by the way she kept glancing at me, almost daring me to explode, that was exactly what she wanted. So I did the one thing neither of them expected. I didn't scream. I didn't hit him. I didn't even stay. I simply turned around and walked out. But before leaving, I reached over to the chair and picked up his jacket. Not out of strategy, not out of planning, just instinct. I didn't even think about it at the time. The hallway felt colder than usual as I stepped out. I closed the door behind me without slamming it. The silence of the corridor pressed in on me, broken only by the faint hum of the building's heater. I walked down the stairs and out into the night air. The city was quiet at that hour, empty streets stretching out under yellow streetlights. I kept walking, not caring where my feet carried me. Every detail of what I had just seen replayed in my head on a loop. Her laugh, sharp and careless. His smirk, confident and unbothered. The way they looked at me as though I was the intruder in my own home. The weight of it wasn't just betrayal. It was humiliation. They hadn't just crossed a line. They had laughed while doing it, certain I was too weak or too blind to stop them. I didn't sleep that night. I walked until the sun began to rise, then sat on a bench watching people head to work as though nothing in the world had changed. For them, maybe nothing had. For me, everything had. When I finally pulled the jacket tighter around me, I noticed something in the pocket. His wallet. He must have left it there. Inside were his ID, his cards, a photo of him with his parents. It wasn't evidence I was looking for, but it was a reminder. A reminder that the man who had stood by my side for years, the man I had trusted with everything, had been sneaking behind my back with the one person I thought would never betray me. I didn't feel sorrow. I felt something colder. Not revenge exactly, but a certainty that this wasn't the end. What happened that night wasn't going to disappear into silence. They thought I would crack, that I would fold under the weight of it. Instead, I felt sharper than I ever had. The pieces of my life had been ripped apart, but in that mess, something solid began to take shape. The night ended not with closure, not with forgiveness, but with the simple truth that nothing would ever be the same again. And deep down, I knew one thing. The story was only just beginning. The morning after that night felt heavier than any hangover. I hadn't drunk a drop, but my head throbbed as though someone had hammered against it for hours. The sun was up, bright and indifferent, cutting across the blinds in my small apartment where I had spent what was left of the night. I didn't bother going back to the place I used to call home. That word had already lost its meaning. I expected silence from them after what had happened, at least for a while. I thought they would try to lay low, avoid me, maybe even hide behind excuses. Instead, the opposite happened. By late morning, there was a knock on my door. Two shadows blocked the light from the hallway window. When I opened it, there they were, standing side by side as if they had rehearsed it. She had her arms folded, chin lifted like a lawyer walking into a courtroom. He stood half a step behind her, hands shoved into his pockets, wearing the same careless smirk I had seen hours before. Neither of them looked like people begging forgiveness. They looked like people who had come to deliver a verdict. Without waiting for an invitation, she pushed past me into the apartment. He followed casually, glancing around like he was inspecting the place. My stomach turned at the sight. The audacity of it struck harder than their betrayal the night before. She began speaking immediately, her voice sharp and rehearsed. She said I had overreacted, that what happened between them was complicated, that I needed to understand the bigger picture. Every word was coated with arrogance, as though she were a teacher explaining basic facts to a child. I asked her plainly why they came. If it was an apology, she hadn't said the words. She looked at me with narrowed eyes and told me she wasn't here to beg. She was here to make sure I saw things clearly. He leaned against the counter, nodding in agreement like some smug backup singer. He said we'd been friends long enough that I should know he didn't mean to hurt me. He called it a mistake, one that got out of hand. But his body language told a different story. He wasn't ashamed. He wasn't guilty. He was annoyed I was even forcing him to explain. The more they spoke, the more the gaslighting came through. She told me I had been too busy with work, that she felt lonely, that he had been there for her. She twisted it as though their affair was the natural result of my neglect. He added fuel, saying things between them just happened, and that if I hadn't been so blind, maybe I would have noticed sooner. It wasn't a confession. It was an attack. I didn't shout back. I didn't argue. I just listened. My silence seemed to irritate them more than anything else. She raised her voice, accusing me of standing there like a victim, trying to guilt her into submission. He shook his head and muttered that I always made things bigger than they were. When I didn't respond, she finally lost patience. She slammed her hand against the counter and said something that shifted the ground under my feet. She admitted she wasn't even sure she wanted to marry me anymore. That night hadn't been a slip. It was clarity. The wedding, she said, had been feeling like a cage, and maybe this was the sign she needed to reconsider. The best friend didn't even flinch at her words. He just stared at me, expression calm, like he had been waiting for her to finally admit it. The weight of that moment hit harder than the sight of them in bed together. This wasn't just betrayal. It was the dismantling of my future, spoken aloud in my own space. I told them to leave. My voice was calm, steady. They lingered, perhaps waiting for me to explode, but when I didn't, she rolled her eyes and stormed out. He followed slowly, brushing past me with a shoulder bump, whispering something under his breath I couldn't quite catch. I didn't care to. Word didn't take long to spread. By evening, I started receiving messages from friends. Some were sympathetic, but most carried an undertone of gossip. People had already taken sides. A few suggested I let it go to avoid embarrassment. One mutual acquaintance called me dramatic for walking in on them instead of talking first. The social current turned faster than I anticipated. By the second day, it was as if I were the one on trial. I heard through another friend that she was telling people I had driven her to this because of how cold I had been. She painted me as absent, detached, too focused on work. He backed her up, telling anyone who listened that they hadn't planned for it to happen, but that they had feelings now and couldn't deny them. The narrative spread like oil on water. People I thought were close to me started repeating their lines, suggesting I should take some of the blame. Betrayal hurt, but this part, watching the story warp until I became the villain, hit deeper. One moment stuck with me during that whirlwind of days. A mutual friend I had trusted came to see me. He sat across from me and couldn't look me in the eye. Eventually, he admitted he had seen them together weeks earlier. He hadn't wanted to say anything. He didn't want to be involved. His silence had protected them, not me. That revelation cut through me more than I expected. It showed me that betrayal wasn't contained between two people. It spread like a virus. Once people knew, they chose sides. And many chose theirs, either out of convenience, fear, or simply because they didn't care enough about me to stand up. I walked through those days like a shadow, watching my life tilt. Everywhere I went, I felt eyes on me. In shops, at work, even walking down the street, I could sense the whispers. In a small city, stories don't stay hidden. They grow teeth. Despite everything, I refused to defend myself publicly. I didn't write long posts online. I didn't plead with mutual friends to hear my side. I stayed silent. And that silence unnerved them. I could see it when I passed her once in the supermarket. She stopped mid-sentence, staring at me as though expecting a fight. When I just walked past without a word, her expression twisted into frustration. That was the shift. They had expected me to rage, to fight, to chase after explanations. Instead, I left them with nothing. My silence was heavier than shouting. It gave them space to unravel on their own. But the damage was already spreading. Invitations to dinners dried up. Calls went unanswered. Friends I had known for years stepped back, uncomfortable with the mess. The isolation felt deliberate, orchestrated, as though they were cutting me out of the circle we had all shared. Yet beneath that isolation, I felt a strange clarity. They thought they were dismantling me, but what they didn't realize was that every arrogant word, every lie they told, every sideways glance from friends, was sharpening something inside me. The more they tried to rewrite the story, the more determined I became not to let them dictate the ending. The confrontation that began in my apartment was only the start. They had walked in as though they owned the narrative, as though their betrayal was something I had to accept. But the cracks in their arrogance were already showing. And soon, those cracks would split wide enough for everyone to see. By the third week, silence wasn't enough to keep the storm away. I had stayed quiet, refusing to defend myself, refusing to explain what had happened. I thought that would protect me from more humiliation. Instead, it created a vacuum that everyone else filled with their own stories. It started small. A cousin of mine told me he'd heard whispers at work that my fiancée had moved on, and that I'd been the one who couldn't accept it. A neighbor asked why I looked so bitter lately. Even people who weren't close suddenly had opinions. It was like watching a wildfire spread through dry grass. The more I ignored it, the faster it burned. Then came the phone call from her parents. They wanted to talk. Not apologize, not admit their daughter had shattered the life I'd been building, but to talk. They invited me to dinner at their home, assuring me it was for the best. Against my better judgment, I agreed. Maybe a part of me still wanted clarity, some acknowledgement of what had happened. The night of the dinner felt like walking into enemy territory. Their house, once a place I had been welcomed into, now carried an edge. The lights were warm, the table was set, but the atmosphere was rigid, like everyone had been waiting for me to walk in so the performance could begin. She was already there, sitting at the table in a pale dress, looking composed, even graceful. Beside her sat my best friend, in a pressed shirt, his hair styled as though he were meeting important guests. Seeing him there at her family's table was a blow I hadn't expected. It told me instantly whose side they were on. Her parents greeted me with polite smiles that didn't reach their eyes. My own relatives were there too. My mother, my uncle, and a few others who had been persuaded that this was the right place to resolve things. From the moment I sat down, I realized I wasn't there for resolution. I was there to be cornered. The meal began with forced small talk. Her father poured wine. Her mother passed around dishes, everyone speaking in soft tones that didn't match the tension sitting in the room. Finally, her mother cleared her throat and began the speech I knew had been rehearsed. She said every couple goes through challenges, that mistakes are part of life, that what happened between her daughter and my so-called friend was regrettable, but not unforgivable. I stayed silent, staring at the tablecloth, tracing the pattern with my eyes while my blood boiled underneath. When I didn't respond, my uncle stepped in, echoing their words. He told me I shouldn't throw away years over one mistake. My mother looked at me with pleading eyes, asking me to at least listen. The words blurred into noise. They were all speaking at me, not with me. Each sentence was another weight pushing down, another attempt to normalize the betrayal, to make it something small, something survivable. Finally, she herself spoke. My fiancée. Her tone was calm, almost confident, as if she had been waiting for the stage to be hers. She said she still loved me, but she couldn't ignore how distant I had been. She said the night I caught them was an accident, a mistake that looked worse than it was. She even had the audacity to claim it had been the first time. The lie nearly made me laugh. My silence must have unnerved her, because she grew sharper, her words cutting deeper. She said I had always been controlling, always too serious, never knowing how to relax. She claimed the affair wasn't just her fault, that I had pushed her towards someone who made her feel alive again. The room shifted after that. Some relatives murmured in agreement, others frowned, but no one called her out. It was as if they had all decided the narrative in advance. I was too rigid, she had slipped, he had been convenient, and now it was my job to either forgive or walk away quietly. But then the unexpected happened. The best friend, who had been silent through most of the dinner, suddenly snapped. She had been painting him as a minor figure, a bystander in her story, someone who had accidentally been pulled into her loneliness. He couldn't take it. He slammed his hand on the table, rattling the glasses, and shouted that it hadn't been one night. It had been months. He yelled that she had begged for it, that she wasn't some innocent victim of neglect, that she had chosen it again and again. The room exploded. Her parents shouted at him to stop, her mother's face turning pale. She screamed at him, calling him a liar, accusing him of trying to ruin her life. He shouted back, furious at being thrown under the bus. The careful illusion of regret and forgiveness shattered in an instant. My relatives sat stunned, their rehearsed lines suddenly meaningless. My uncle shifted uncomfortably, my mother's face hardened. Even her father, who had tried to keep everything polite, was gripping his glass so tightly it looked like it might break. I sat back in my chair and watched the chaos unfold. I didn't need to add a single word. They were tearing themselves apart without me. Every truth that had been buried under rehearsed speeches and forced civility was spilling out, raw and undeniable. She turned on me then, shouting that I was just sitting there, letting him lie about her. She demanded I defend her, that I correct him. But I stayed silent. My silence wasn't weakness anymore. It was a weapon, cutting through the room sharper than any accusation. When the shouting reached its peak, I stood. I didn't raise my voice, didn't slam my fists, didn't argue. I simply told them I was finished. Not with anger, not with tears, just a calm statement that carried finality. Then I walked out. The night air hit me like a release. Behind me, voices still rose in chaos, but I didn't look back. My feet carried me down the street, away from the house, away from the people who had tried to corner me into forgiving what was unforgivable. By the time I reached the end of the block, my phone buzzed with messages. Some from relatives begging me to return, others from friends who had already heard snippets of what happened at dinner. Word was spreading faster than ever, but this time the story wasn't so neatly controlled. The cracks were showing. People were beginning to see the truth. Walking alone under the streetlights, I realized something had shifted. Until then, I had been reacting to their actions, their words, their betrayals. But now, the weight had shifted back onto them. Their carefully crafted version of events had collapsed under their own arrogance. And I didn't need to do a thing. The consequences were no longer in my hands. They were in theirs. The dinner had been the breaking point. Until that night, everything had been whispered, spun, controlled in fragments. Afterward, the truth leaked out faster than anyone could contain it. I didn't need to shout, didn't need to prove anything. They exposed themselves, and all I had to do was step aside and let the cracks split wide open. The wedding was still on paper. Deposits had been made, venues booked, invitations sent. People expected a ceremony in a matter of weeks. But as the chaos of that dinner spread, the idea of standing in front of anyone, pretending there was love left, became laughable. I contacted the venue myself. Calm, polite, straightforward. I explained the situation, made sure every invoice tied back to her side of the contract. When the cancellation fees hit, they landed directly in her lap. Thousands gone in an instant. Her call started the next day. At first she was furious. She demanded I reverse the cancellations, accusing me of humiliating her. She shouted about how her parents were livid, how people were asking questions she couldn't answer. When I didn't respond, her tone shifted. The rage became pleading. She begged me to be reasonable, to at least split the costs. I ignored her. She had been so confident in that dinner room, spinning her story, shifting the blame. Now, with the bills landing squarely on her, her confidence cracked. The best friend tried his turn too. He texted me late at night, short, clipped messages. At first, they dripped arrogance, as if I had lost more than he had. He told me I was throwing away a future out of pride, that she had chosen him because I was weak. But as the days passed, his tone shifted as well. The messages grew longer, messier. He complained about her, about how she was demanding, how she blamed him for everything falling apart. He admitted his own parents had found out and were ashamed. He hinted that his job had started looking at him differently, co-workers whispering, supervisors questioning his professionalism. The cracks weren't just personal anymore. They were professional, financial, social. Every choice they made together was cutting them deeper. Meanwhile, I stayed still. I went to work, kept my head down, lived quietly. My phone buzzed constantly with gossip, but I didn't participate. Friends who had distanced themselves began trickling back, curious, trying to confirm the stories. Some admitted they had believed her version at first. Now, with the dinner fallout spreading, they weren't so sure. Her family doubled down, at least in public. They told anyone who asked that it was just drama, that young people always worked through these things. But their words rang hollow. The truth had escaped, and no amount of smoothing could hide it. By the end of the month, she had become a figure of whispered judgment. People smiled to her face, but exchanged glances behind her back. I heard she tried to salvage her reputation by distancing herself from him. She claimed he had taken advantage, that he had exaggerated their closeness. He didn't take it quietly. One night, while drunk, he posted online a long, rambling confession that named dates, places, even details of how long it had been going on. Screenshots spread fast, disappearing almost as quickly as they were posted, but not before enough people had seen them. The damage was permanent. Their alliance collapsed overnight. She blocked him. He lashed out, their once smug bond dissolving into bitter blame. Friends who had tolerated their arrogance before now cut ties completely. Neither of them could walk into a bar, a restaurant, or even a grocery store without feeling eyes on them. The financial strain hit next. With the wedding canceled and debts piling up, she was forced to take on more hours at her job. The image she had curated, of someone headed toward a perfect, comfortable marriage, crumbled under the weight of overdue bills and social scorn. He, meanwhile, lost his job within weeks. Officially, it was a restructuring. Unofficially, his reputation had poisoned the atmosphere. Employers don't like whispers about personal scandals spreading into the workplace. I watched all of this unfold from a distance. Not with joy, not with pity, but with clarity. They had thought I would be destroyed by their betrayal. They thought I would rage, spiral, beg. Instead, I stepped aside and let life take its course. And life, with its cold efficiency, dismantled them piece by piece. One afternoon, months later, I passed her on the street. She didn't see me at first. She was carrying grocery bags, her hair tied back messily, her face pale with exhaustion. When she finally noticed me, she froze. For a heartbeat, her eyes softened, almost pleading. Then she looked away, quick, ashamed, and hurried off. The proud, confident woman who had once mocked me in my own bedroom now couldn't meet my gaze on a public sidewalk. As for him, the last I heard, he had moved back in with his parents. Friends who still kept loose contact told me he spent most nights drinking, bitter, convinced the world had turned against him. In truth, the world hadn't done a thing. He had carved his own exile. And me? I rebuilt, slowly. I cut away the people who had chosen their side, kept only those who had proven loyal. The circle became smaller, but sharper, steadier. I found peace in the quiet, in the absence of constant noise and drama. There were no more wedding plans, no more arguments, no more false friends filling my weekends with empty laughter. What remained was solid. The consequences had landed exactly where they belonged. She bore the debt and the whispers. He bore the unemployment and the shame. Their perfect little secret had turned into a public disaster neither of them could escape. People sometimes asked me why I never fought harder, why I never lashed out, why I didn't take revenge. I told them the truth. I didn't need to. They did it to themselves. Betrayal carries its own punishment. You just have to give it room to breathe. And so the story ended not with fireworks, not with fists, but with silence. The kind of silence that comes after a storm has ripped through a field, leaving wreckage scattered, but also leaving space for new growth. I walked away with peace. They stayed behind in ruins. And that's the story. If you're still here, that means you're one of us. So go ahead, hit that subscribe button. I drop new chaos every single day, and trust me, tomorrow's story, it's even worse than this one.